the Kaiser, so the emperor, who abdicated at the end of World War One. Then after the chaos of the Weimar Republic, you had the Nazis, and they had all their statues and their myths and their martyrs, like Horst Wessel. And then they were swept aside. And in Eastern Germany, the communists arose, and they had their martyrs, and they had their statues. After every regime in Germany has been deposed or changed or collapses, there's a period where people get rid of the monuments. Rarely is it like what's going on now. The Germans tend not to go with ropes and pull down memorials. They do it collectively, but local authorities do take down statues. And then you always have the discussion, what should be left and what should be gotten rid of. You can get rid of too much and you can leave too much. And I'm not informed enough to be able to tell people intelligently where that balance is. But what I can say is that I think it was even Thomas Jefferson who said, you need a revolution every couple generations. It's good for the system. And I think he was right. Ironically, there are people who want to get rid of his statue in the Jefferson Memorial in Washington. I will not defend any Confederate statue anywhere in the country. Let them all go. Fine. But what is bothering me a lot is there was in Madison, Wisconsin, on the Capitol Square, a statue that was taken down that, as I understand the written text I could find, was a Norwegian immigrant, admittedly a statue in a uniform, because he was killed fighting the Confederacy. We also know that there was an abolitionist, his name was Baldwin, I've misplaced his first name, in Philadelphia, who actually integrated his workforce in his locomotive factory in Philadelphia in the early 1800s, and he was against slavery. And his statue was defaced, and someone tried to pull it down. I don't think they succeeded, and I think the graffiti was removed. So while I applaud people having revolutionary fervor and saying we have to turn the society around, because that's what revolution is you have to turn around and say we're not going to continue in this direction, we're going to stop and turn. Almost every revolution goes too far. I can't say what that is to go too far, except for this, that when they start pulling down, if you will, the wrong statues of Norwegian pioneers who died fighting the Confederacy, or others who actually integrated their workforces when nobody else was doing it, the revolution has gone too far. There's a cautionary tale here that every revolution there ever was, the Bolshevik, the French, every revolution, the American Revolution.
Yeah.
There's always a counter-revolution. The Protestant Reformation was really a revolution, where you took the Catholic Church and booted it out of what's now Eastern Germany. Well, there was a counter-revolution where they literally were taking, Protestant pastors, and there were trials and, against heretics and whatever. So if the young people, mostly young people, who are feeding this revolution in the United States want to succeed, I implore you to slow down and to do the research and find out what statues are you wanting to get rid of. Don't take down the wrong ones. And the other thing, and I'm almost 60, so I'm an old fart, and I've got a few gray hairs I've earned. A little bit of wisdom and prudence goes a long way. For example, are you thinking, young people, if you do these things, you can do it. You can burn a police precinct in Minneapolis. It happened. You can burn down a couple hundred businesses in St. Paul, Minneapolis. You can do it. It's been done. What will be the consequences? Try to anticipate before you do these things what could happen and how will you address that which happens. That's why we study history. If you do this, this, and this, you're likely to get that, and that result. So slow it down. I wish people success in changing the culture. It needs desperately to be fundamentally changed, but do it wisely. Knock off all the excesses that are inappropriate and misguided. Like Jefferson, we can take him as one case study. He had enslaved people. He had a concubine who worked out a contract with him before they returned from his stay in France. And they agreed that if you stay with me, go back to the United States, or the Young Republic, whatever it was by then, your children, our offspring, will be free at 21. The man is very complex. He's very complicated. He did have ideals. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the U.S. government that we got, that at the time was groundbreaking. In the 1780s, it was radical, okay? But he was also a human, and most humans are complex. Marx certainly is. So is the guest speaker today. We're all complex. If you're not complex, stand up and tell me, because I want to shake your hand. You're the only person I know who's not complex. Jefferson is the one who laid out the Midwest. It's in my book. You can go to Amazon.com and click on several of our books. The one I'm thinking of is At Home in the Heartland. And there's a section, I think it's 2 or 3 pages. The Midwest was a construct. Jefferson molded it as of Ohio to lay out the land in these square mile parcels and the counties so that everyone was no more than a buggy ride away from their seat of government. In every little county seat, there was supposed to be a square left for the courthouse and for a school and a fairgrounds to show the latest agricultural innovations. And this was groundbreaking stuff. It was also social engineering, which all the Republicans decry. Oh, you can't engineer society. Oh, that's socialism. Well, Jefferson did. And the whole Midwest was built on social engineering, the whole Midwest. And it's why it's different than the South and even New England and the West. So rather than just calling it flyover land and dismissing it, people actually did their research. You can buy our book and help fund our Baseum. It was done on purpose by a man who had enslaved people. So to go to Washington and take a big bomb and destroy a statue, will that make the past change? Will it help people understand the complexity of the human mind and human experience? I don't think so. So I want to talk about racism. Can we do that?
Well, but before we do that, let me remind folks that we are speaking to Michael Lueck-Troms. He is the person at the center of TRACES, Center for History and Culture.
Yeah.
You just heard him mention a book, At Home in the Heartland. There's more writings and more videos and more information via Michael that we'll have on the Northern Spirit Radio.org website, including pointing you to traces.org, their website. That stuff is always on northernspiritradio.org. Come and post comments on our programs, rate them. There's a donate button so you can support us, but follow your way to these people and these organizations who are working to make the better world. And we need that so much. And fortunately, we are in a time where there's great possibilities for good and for ill. So I don't think that there's any revolution that doesn't include both possibilities in it. I have a friend here locally in Eau Claire from Egypt who has talked to me extensively about the thing that we call the Arab Spring, which had great potential. I mean, are we going to get democracy in Egypt? Well, as we know, throughout most countries in the Middle East, Arab Spring has not brought summer. It's brought actually a pretty cold winter in most places. And Egypt is, I think, in worse shape than it was before the 2011 uprising. So the point being that when we study from history, we have a chance of learning some of the possibilities so we can proceed, as Michael Lueck-Troms says, in wisdom. Wisdom is a key component to making the good choice on these bifurcations in our possibilities. And again, northernspiritradio.org is where you'll find the links. And I also want to urge you to support the kind of community radio stations who carry these programs. We have some 40 plus stations across the US who carry our shows, and we so much appreciate it when you support them, because getting the word out, alternative, not filtered through the money-making apparatus or even the government limitations, just community radio where it's volunteers, typically it's people doing great things. They survive on a shoestring, and you can make that shoestring longer and more capable by donating both from your hands and from your pocket. So please support them and support Northern Spirit Radio if you can, and support TRACES Center for History and Culture. One way you can do that is by providing a locale so they can visit your city, so people can avail themselves of the riches that Michael Lueck-Troms and the other folks with TRACES have put together. Please, there's so many good things that we can be doing. Build the community as well as dismantling the parts that don't work. So now back to Michael. I think you wanted to talk about racism.
I think so too, but as long as we're doing station identification, I appreciate Mark's help. Without people like Mark, we couldn't get our word out there. You can indeed go to our website, traces.org. There's little prompts on the right. You can go to our YouTube channel that has all of our videos that are in the bus and some more. We are on Facebook, both me privately, where I can say what I want, and Traces Spuren, where I cannot say all that I want. It has to stay relatively nonpartisan and a-religious. I want to mention, though, also what Mark says about our books. We do have our exhibit catalog on our Amazon.com account now, and we have past books. The diaries of Midwest soldiers who were in German camps in World War II. We have the letters of the German soldiers who were in American POW camps in World War II. We have their letters. We interviewed 50 of both sets of people. We interviewed almost 100 veterans from World War II on both sides, aggregately about their experiences. So do go look at our books, because these are exactly the topics that we're talking about. And the one that I really want to get to in the last 15 minutes or so that remain of our hour is racism as such. Mark mentioned going to Rwanda and other examples. All genocidal experiences or mass murder or mass injustice or even institutionalized injustice that goes on over time, not just a flare-up, but is a way of life. Things that might appear racist aren't always only based on skin color. When, was it Eric Garner who said, I can't breathe in the streets of Harlem on the sidewalk? If you look at the video, too many of the cops in the background who were there were men of color. I don't remember any women, but they were officers of color, brown, black, etc. And if I'm not mistaken, of the 4 men that worked together to kill George Floyd, one was African American, and I think another one might have been Asian American. That's my memory of it. So what happens to the idea that all these people are the victims of racism when you point out that many of the, quote, in German, the Täter, the perpetrators, were also people of color? So the issue of racism becomes more complicated when you nuance it. So on an easy polemic level, you can say, oh, well, racism is about skin color. It's not that easy. I'm no expert, but I'm interested in the settlement of communities, of patterns. And I remember once having a course somewhere that if you look at southern towns built before 1865, they tended to be one main street, one road, and the houses and buildings along it, and less so often a grid, a community where there's sort of proximity. And if you look at southern architecture, non-plantation owners not as often had 2-story tall houses like in the Midwest and other places where you didn't have slavery as a system. In the Midwest, as I just mentioned, the towns were predominantly laid out in a grid pattern, closer together with public spaces. And it had everything to do with governance. In the South, before the Civil War, you had the plantation owners calling the shots. You didn't need a big, popularly accessible county courthouse, because local justice was often influenced by those who had the land and called the shots and the money. So very different societies. And I heard once a public radio interview with a man who wrote a book about the missions of California in the 1600s, 1700s, and it was similar. There was a thing going on with the Catholic missions along the West Coast and into New Mexico, what's now New Mexico and Arizona, that they were a kind of plantation. They weren't raising cotton and indigo and tobacco and corn per se, but they also basically coerced or forced the natives to live together and to learn Spanish and to leave their language and to learn white people's ways and to change their religion and to work in the fields and to do leather working and build wagons and blacksmithing and stuff like that. So this whole question of racism becomes nuanced when you begin to think about it's actually forcing a group of people to do something they wouldn't do otherwise. And I also heard something interesting recently about the police forces of the South in the past versus the police forces of the North. And certainly when Mark asked the question earlier about the KKK of the first wave, the 1860s, after all these people of color were freed from the plantations, white folks were terrified. I mean, they'd been afraid already for 150 or 200 years that the blacks might rebel and say, we're not going to live that way. Well, now they were legally freed and they could do what they wanted. So the Klan riding through the night, terrorizing people, was to, quote, keep them in their place. And it is said, maybe it's true, I'm not sure, that the whole police departments of the South, historically, before World War II, tended to be different. They weren't police forces as we knew them in Milwaukee or Des Moines or Boston. In the North, police forces were more urban, they were more organized, they were more extensive, and it was about keeping order on the streets. But whether you have a voluntary police force in the South, like the KKK in that period, or to keep people in line during Jim Crow until desegregation of the 1960s, it's about keeping people in line. Betsy Hodges, who I never was a big fan of, the quite, quote, white, liberal, democratic former mayor of Minneapolis, I think just before Mr. Fry, what's his first name? Jacob Fry, she wrote recently in the New York Times that one of the problems in the Twin Cities are the white liberals who give out all this money through the different foundations to, bus kids. And Michelle Norris grew up, she was the recipient of some of this opportunity in the 60s and 70s. She grew up in South Minneapolis. She has also an interesting interview available online. So these white liberals want to support, this equal society. But in reality, if you're white in Minnesota, I've lived in Minnesota, I still have a condo in St. Paul, you could have a great life. But if you're not white, not so much. And many of the numbers, the statistics for Black and brown living in Minnesota do not compare well with being Black or brown somewhere else in the United States. For example, maybe California or New York, I don't know. But there's a problem. There's a discrepancy between the white liberal vision of who we are in the upper Midwest and what actually happens on the ground. That people of color, they just don't have the access to the property, to the capital, to job interviews, to getting a job. So part of the problem are these white liberals, and Betsy Hodges said it herself, and she is a white liberal Democrat, former mayor of Minneapolis, that this discrepancy between what you say you believe and do and what really happens. And she argues, and I think she's right, one of the reasons that the Minneapolis police system was so prone to racist excesses was because basically white taxpayers in Edina and in Minneapolis and the inner ring suburbs were paying the police to keep them away from my property. So like in the South, the, quote, night riders, the Klan dressed up after the Civil War, they were riding to keep them away from our women and our property and our cotton warehouses and our banks and our railroad stations, keep them out. A similar thing was going on in Minneapolis and maybe to a lesser extent, St. Paul. So the whole issue of racism isn't just skin color, but it's who's in the out group, who's in the in group. And if you look at American history, the Italians came. We call them Dagos. The Irish came. We call them lots of things. Alcoholics, hooligans. The Jews came. We had the Spics. We've had the fags. We've had the niggers. So in the United States, we've always found a group, not necessarily Black or brown, to put down at the bottom. And they're cheap labor. They're there when we want them or need them during economic cycles of boom and bust. So we have to have some sort of a police force to keep them available as a pool of labor. When times are good, like during World War II or the 1950s, high employment because people can fill jobs. Scooping up our ice cream at the ice cream parlor or filling our tanks at the local gas stations. When I was growing up, we still had attendants who filled your car. You didn't fill your own car. So you had cheap labor you could bring in. When people filling those jobs say, we don't want to do that anymore. We want our kids to go to college. We want them to have an interview chance and get a better job. Then the mix changes. I would argue that part of the racist story in the United States has to do with empire, and I'm not a communist, but if you just look at all the imperial cities, London, Paris, Madrid, New York, they were so grand with so much wealth and so many lines of power because someone somewhere else was working for the man that built all that. The Belgian Congo, brutal, merciless, killing people, putting them in camps and saying, if you don't go out and tap enough rubber today, we'll kill your wife and kids. All right. And they'll stay behind this barbed wire until you come back with X number of kilos of rubber. That's just one example. There's so many. But Europeans, wherever we went, found some, quote, little nigger. We found someone to force to do something that they wouldn't do otherwise. And this is the problem. It's not just your skin color, because actually in America today, it's possible to be in the in group and be dark skinned. We saw that with the war in Afghanistan. We saw it in the war with Iraq. I mean, Afghanistan is debatable after 9/11, but with Iraq, there was no yellow cake. It was about something different. It was about resources. And we had to have our people go over and put their people in check through intimidation, through guns, through patrols. And so someone somewhere has to pay for our way of life. You know, how dare they have our oil under their sand, right? With empire, you almost always have to have a war, and a war is organized force. I'm going to wage a war and force you, when I win this skirmish that we're calling a war, then you will give me your crops, you will give me your gold bars you've hidden under the bedroom floor, you will give me your children to come to my factories. I'll give you an example. In German, and English is largely a Germanic language, in the Third Reich, we all know the word Third Reich. What does it mean? It's the Third Empire. The Second Empire was under the Kaiser, the 1890s onward, 1870s onward, and the First Reich, if I'm not mistaken, goes back to Karl the Great, the Holy Roman Empire. The word German Reich, the word, also means to be rich. And it's not a coincidence that the word for empire in German means to become rich. That's what an empire is. You put up a border, you expand it, and then you siphon off the riches of the conquered peasants, of the conquered princes from the other side, of the equivalent of factories or railroads or whatever. You stretch out your borders, you expand the Reich, and then you start plundering the riches. Same with the word soldier in German, Krieger. Krieger means to get, literally to kriegen. Ich kriege dich, I will get you. And I'm a Krieger, and a warrior is a Krieg. So even the word war means to go get. All right? So literally, if we wage wars, we are going to get booty. And it's not even enough to talk about racism. You have to talk about empire. It's not enough to talk about empire. You have to talk about war. It's not even enough to talk about war. You have to talk about force. I will come and I will force you with my bigger guns and my bigger armies and my bigger horses and my bigger sabers, and I will fight you until you succumb or I kill you, and then I'll do what I want with your territory, with your capital. And this brings back to the topic of slavery in general, and we need to go back. So the Romans had slaves. Now, some white liberal academics will argue, oh, well, Romans and slavery, it wasn't based on skin color. It was a better slavery. It was just, vanquished populations from North Africa or from the Middle East or from Northern Europe. They would enslave the Germanic wild people up in the Rhineland. Well, they were forcing these people to go to Rome, to Pompeii, to wherever, and to work for them. And you could earn your freedom, perhaps. You could even become a slave-holding person. If you fast forward to the 1500s, Arabs were running the slave trade of Northern Africa and the Mediterranean. One of the reasons we fought the war, the Young Republic, on the Barbary Coast, I think it was Jefferson, or we had the Battle of Tipperary, if I'm not mixing my motifs, because they were capturing sailors on American ships and enslaving them. There were white slaves, people who were enslaved who had been sailors on the Mediterranean or on the Atlantic. Well, this wouldn't work, and so we sent our ships and we blasted the hell out of them. So it was Arabs in the modern era who helped set up the European slave trade, and the European slave trade was all about empire, to go off to Africa above all, but other places. There were people who, quote, voluntarily went from what's now Malaysia and Indonesia. They were sent to Southern Africa by the British. There were people from Southern India who were sent to Southern Africa to work in the fields and the mines. So they were sent voluntarily, not so voluntarily. If you Google in Australia, the people from Papua New Guinea and other Indonesian Pacific islands who were basically lured or brought through coercion to Australia to work the sugar plantations. It's the same story, just different location and different names. So if we want to talk about racism, we can't change the situation unless we admit many of us have a vested interest in perpetuating the system. Are you going to give up your cozy house in the suburbs? Are you going to give up your nice job? Are you going to really let those people live next door? Are you going to let them take your kids' place at that business? So if we want to stop racism, we have to talk about forcing people and stop forcing people to do things they wouldn't do otherwise. We have to learn to give people opportunities and real chances at betterment, but we can't force them. We have to work with them, not overpower them. And that's the central problem.
There are so many problems that need to be addressed. And I'm really thankful for you, Michael Lewis-Krams, providing an overview that will be helpful. I worry that in the United States, we'll focus on one small subsection so that we won't, it's whack-a-mole, right? You hit one problem, it pops up in another. Unless you have the overview, it's hard to know how you get to a real solution. I do want to step back and review a little bit more. You started in on the various waves of racism that we've had in this country. You talked about the KKK immediately following the Civil War. You've talked not quite as concretely or as definitively about the second wave, which happened in the early 1900s, 1920s, going in there. You also speak in your video that is on the traces.org website. You talk about the third wave. Could you say a little bit about that? Because, of course, that comes home to us. We know about George Floyd now and many other people. You've mentioned a couple of them who have been victims of racism today. But the KKK, the resurgence of white supremacy, the third wave that you speak of, when does that start?
So the second wave sort of died out as World War II expanded to include the United States. Also, the end of the Great Depression. During the Depression, people had more to worry about than just intimidating their neighbors of whatever background. But certainly by the time World War II was in full force, people were busy with other things. So the second wave sort of died out the end of the 30s, by the end of World War II. It depends on who you are and how you're counting, but the third wave began to arise late 40s, in the 50s. You have sympathetic organizations like the John Birch Society, which I remember too well growing up, was active. There have been other groups. I'm not as much an expert on the third wave. What historians try to do is find some distance from the subject. The third wave is still among us. You can look at internationally, there are different faces of this. The Front National in France with Marine Le Pen, the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, what's translated the Alternative for Germany. It's a political party, but it's a house where even the AfD is now kicking out some of their members for being too far right, to being too Nazi, which in Germany we don't accuse each other of very lightly. It's a huge thing if you say someone's a Nazi. If you do it unfounded, you can actually get fined or put in jail. I'm not as much an expert in the situation in the United States. I would invite you, Mark, to have a guest speaker who's much better informed. All I will say at this point is certainly there are people around underfoot at the moment who would like to exploit the current instability and explosiveness for their own purposes. And these are people who don't want to expand love and understanding and domestic harmony. I can't say a lot more about it at this point. I think you know more than I do about the third wave.
Well, it's important to realize that the KKK, the white nationalism, the racism is never an issue of the past. There's always tendrils of it coming into the future in all countries around the world. I appreciate you mentioning what's happening in France and in Germany, because sometimes in the US, we want to think that we're the only ones with this problem, and we see the world domination issue as only a US thing. But you only have to go back 70 years when US was not the top force in the world to understand that the racism and again, racism is an insufficient word because, as you mentioned, in the second wave, it was really Catholics
Yeah.
who were in the upper Midwest, the primary victims of the KKK. So there is always someone you want to hold down, spit on,
Yeah.
in some way victimize in order to have some benefits for yourself.
Based on what you're saying, it does occur to me, I mentioned the Five Star Movement in Italy, which is also vehemently against refugees or immigrants. In Britain, of course, Brexit was fueled by xenophobic impulses. What you see worldwide, also in Australia, where the Australian government, at least previously, was merciless about putting so-called boat people, refugees at the high seas, not in Australian camps. They're putting them in camps, I think, in, again, Papua New Guinea or East Timor or somewhere, but they're putting them offshore with no chance to come onto Australian soil. So one sees worldwide that in predominantly white cultures, there's this backlash. And I think basically it's a fear that whitey's losing it. Whites have been at the top of the international pecking order for 500 years with our slavery, with international travel, global commerce, with our trade lines, with railroad and telegraph, later telephone, now satellite cables. White folks have been the pushing force of much of that. And we have felt entitled. Oh, sort of like the Steve King motto of the world, if we have bestowed this to the world, we've earned to stay at the top and to keep administering it. That's passing. Just from birth rates and death rates, white folks won't stay the dominant force in the world. And then economically, the Chinese have been both frog jumping over us, and the Indians would have tried, but they're stuck in their other problems in India. But things are changing. And I think a lot of people don't even understand this on a rational or conscious level, but they just feel in their gut that, oh, I, as a white person, I stand to have my comfort and my privileges eroded or even taken away. And I think this is why we see so many voters who are voting based on xenophobic and race-related topics like Build the Wall. It's all about keeping, quote, them out.
So you can learn about this by listening to my interviews. There's a previous one 3 months back with Michael Lewick-Troms of Traces Center for History and Culture. You can get their books. And again, traces.org is their website. You can get any number of books, watch the YouTube videos online, and even better, and this is the best, and we need to give people the dates and times as best we can, there's going to be a visit to the Buseum to many areas of the Midwest, where Michael will be conducting the bus. Evidently, he's a reasonably good driver because he's been able to wear out 3 buses so far.
Yeah.
So when are you coming to the Midwest? Where will you be? What dates? What, as near as we can say right now?
Yes.
It's an unfolding schedule, I know.
Yeah, because Corona's basically shredded all of our lovely plans. We are already confirmed to be noon to 6 p.m. Friday the 14th of August in Prairie du Chien, down by the river, sponsored by the library and the Chamber of Commerce. Then we hope to be on the University of Wisconsin-Madison campus Saturday and Sunday. The